amazing looking at all of these pictures of all of these shows. This is a disappearing number, which was a devised piece from about 12 years ago about mathematics. Good evening. Hello.
Hello, Simon, and welcome to all of you from Japan to Canada, I'm told. It's wonderful to have you all here for this, well, what for me is a very exciting moment, because a conversation with the great magician of the theatre, a man whose work I've admired for all the time that those images showed us, the last 30 years or so, isn't it, Simon? And who I think of as a great conceptual artist of the theatrical space, as well as a brilliant storyteller. Simon told me to point out to you all that I'm a writer, so I don't see things the way people in the theatre see them quite. I'm always looking for meanings and preoccupations. I'm Lisa Appignanesi, I'm chair of the Royal Society of Literature, one of your hosts for this evening, but it is Complicité, the great Complicité, and the very great Simon McBurney, who is in the frame tonight. When Simon and I first conceived of this conversation, it was still a moment of emergency in the arts. That sort of emergency is still with us, but we have had a promise from our Minister of Culture and from Rishi Sunak that help is on its way. So we're not going to focus in on that, though we may come back to it later. The real reason, or the primary reason I wanted to have this conversation with Simon was that after watching the streaming of the encounter, which I'm told went to some 80,000 people around the world, was watched by 80,000 people around the world, I was completely gobsmacked by the way in which it had translated onto the small screen. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece about the breakdown of a Western mind in the Amazon. It's an extraordinary piece about communication and being at one with nature, and about climate change in that sense, and about the disintegration of mind, something that interests me very much. But what to me was magical was that there was a one man on stage who, while I was watching him on my screen, became so many different people and took me without any visual images into the heart of the Amazon, as well as into the heart of the mind, if one can mix those metaphors. So really, Simon, what I want to talk about, first of all, is why this particular work has translated so well onto the small screen, and what can we learn from it in these times when so much of theatre needs somehow to be helped by a life of streaming of some kind. Go.
Why is it transformed so well? You know, it's really very difficult to put your finger on precise reasons, but some of the reasons are very simply the ones that you've already talked about. The sense of the disintegration of the mind, but in the piece, if you like, when we were making it, you will have seen in the images at the beginning me speaking into microphones, and then everybody who's helping me make it, and there were many, many people who helped me make it, listening on headphones. And so one of the principal metaphors of the piece was to try and was to have these headphones, so to cut yourself off from the usual sense of being kind of in a collective audience, and to make it a highly individual experience, and also as a consequence of speaking into these several microphones and using a binaural microphone, making it seem as if there is space around you. Rather than speaking from the stage out like that forwards, what happens is it appears that I'm right behind your head. And the intimacy of that, it makes it feel as if, of course, the actor or the voices that you hear are literally next door to you. And that intimacy, as a consequence, will work just as well when you're at a screen, because the key thing is that the sound is exactly the same. now is not just the technical expertise, which means that it works well on the screen. It is, of course, the fact that it's part of the subject of it are the stories that we tell. And this sensation of telling a story, as I can attest from my own children, the moment somebody is sitting there and starting to tell a story, they become absolutely drawn into whatever medium they're using in order to have that story. So you have two forms of intimacy, if you like, that are going on. And then you have, I think, the subject matter, the fact that you are going on an imaginative journey and a literal journey, and through it you start to, the mind of Lauren McIntyre starts to fall apart because of his Western assumptions about everything, the way that he has thought about everything. And I think something about that has been particularly prescient during this time of lockdown and coronavirus, where it's been an enormous time of reflection, I think, for people. People have had to stop, and they've had to look at the world around them, and they had to look at the world within them as well. Of course, some people have escaped by binge watching all of Breaking Bad from beginning to end, and The Wire for the second time, or whatever it is that you like. But a lot of people have, of course, it has been very hard for a lot of people. And so that necessarily puts a stress on what is going on inside here. And this, I suppose, is really what concerns me. When you say, what do we have to learn from this experience? I don't know what there is to learn from this particular piece that we made, but in terms of the sense of our consciousness, this is incredibly important as we go forward, as we think of what might happen in the theatre in the future. I don't think, theatre is not, one of the reasons why theatre is not ideal, there are several reasons why theatre is not ideal in this form as we stand here. One of them is you are not surrounded by people and having this collective experience. Another is the fact that you are, you can walk out and come back in again. Part of the point of theatre is you submit yourself to the time of the performance. And if you go out and, if you have to go out for a pee in the theatre, it's very difficult because you really feel like you've missed something. You don't really want to do it. You quickly go for a pee beforehand, and then you wait until the interval, and then you rush out again. But the thing is that you have to submit yourself to the time. You can't get out of it. And that's also the beautiful thing of watching live music. It is the performers who are taking the charge, if you like, and not allowing us to click, fast forward, rewind, stop, and manipulate the world into around us until we disappear into a fiction of our own making.
I love the idea of theatre as the place where we all pee together.
Yes. Well, there was a wonderful study done at UCL of the fact that when people watch theatre, regardless of the fact that they know each other, after a certain amount of time, their hearts begin to beat in unison. The same thing as happens as when you are very, very close to the person that you love and you are intimate to them, your hearts will begin to beat. This is why we talk about the heart, is the hearts begin to beat together. And so there is an intimate exchange, I think, this intimate exchange that can happen in the theatre. It doesn't always, and, goodness knows, there have been, moments in the theatre where we've wanted to die and kill ourselves, I know. But perhaps later we can talk about what theatre actually means, because I think the term can be very wide, but it is, also this very intimate experience.
I want to take up that word intimacy, but I was suddenly reminded that I had not mentioned that there was live captioning taking place and Claire Hill was doing it. So thank you, Claire, and you can all turn on your live captioning buttons. We are going to take questions. I've got a few that I'm going to interweave into the conversation, and then at 8:15 you can start sending them in or send them in during the time and we will take them. Sorry about that. But to go back to intimacy, Simon, I'm very taken with this thought that when you move to the small screen, that intimacy serves a double purpose. I know that when I go to the theatre to see you, to be completely naive about this, quite often you will step out of role and you will enjoin me, or maybe you're stepping into role, I don't know what you're doing, but you step out from the dimensionality of the theatre into the dimension that I'm in, and you address me directly, and that seems to me to be a breaking down of the so-called fourth wall in theatre. But when you're doing that on a small screen, it's something completely unheard of. We're usually not addressed from our television screens or any other kind of screen. Well, and you did that with the encounter, and it was, to me, it was completely, I keep thinking of a French word, I mean, Rimbaud, the dérèglement de tous les sens. I mean, your senses are completely led astray, askew, tumbled around, and I don't know why.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's curious because we are used to being, in theory, directly addressed by newsreaders, as it were, the idea of direct address or the idea of something happening in front of our eyes, live. That's why reality, sort of television works, is a sort of genre ideally suited to the medium, because it's all about kind of, what is supposedly the here and now. And yet at the same time, what happens is that we are, it is somehow, we are desensitized in some way. We are whatever the opposite of intimate. It becomes not intimate at all, but just kind of entirely voyeuristic, which is completely different. And so that is a really, really interesting and complicated question as to how do you, how can we reach through this thing here? In a way, how can we talk to people, or how can people talk to us? It's something, of course, which has become incredibly important in theatre. And I think of the work of many different people. I had to perform in a show by a wonderful theatre artist called Tim Crouch, called An Oak Tree, in which I didn't know as an actor what I was going to perform. I just went on stage with him. I had an earpiece and he told me what to do. And the audience watched this happening live, and he addressed the audience. And so the whole thing, again, had this extraordinary intimacy. And I found myself being surprised by things and then suddenly weeping, and then the audience weeping, because he broke, as a concept. Why are people doing this? Why should he want to do that? Well, it's partly because we are in a culture of sort of, if you like, desensitization, where we are bludgeoned by so many things all the time that our senses are no longer, they're either jangling our nerves, or else they're kind of become thick-skinned, and the difference between the two things, I mean, of course, there is a connection between the two things. People are sent, there is mental illness is really just so everywhere. The more we seem to seek happiness, the more unhappy we become. And I suppose part of that is also at the heart of the themes of the encounter, which is why I wanted to do it.
Yes, I mean, it's about destabilization in a way, and that's what we're living. We're living destabilization. I mean, while you were speaking about this intimacy and the I was thinking of the popularity of Fleabag. I mean, of course, she's a wonderful performer, but it's also that she comes out of role to address us across the screen, so that we actually think we're with a living person,
yes,
rather than a role. Yeah, and that's very interesting. I mean, there's so many questions here that I kind of want to take some of them in immediately to see where we get to, and as we go along, because it seems to me that we all don't quite know what to do. Theatre is going to look very different. Because COVID is not going to go away for quite a while, or certainly our anxieties about it are not going to go away. So theatre will be a different kind of space. Do you have any fantasies about the kind of space that it might become?
Well, I think that perhaps, I mean, do I have any fantasies?
Visions, I mean.
Yes, I mean, I don't have a grand vision. I'm just excited by the idea that it must change. I mean, theatre is constantly taking in, different ideas and evolving and shifting. When it becomes too commodified, when it becomes the thing which is only there to make a lot of money, that's when, of course, it starts to die. But when actually it's in situations of great difficulty, quite often it starts to live in a new way, so that theatre, in regimes, for example, where it has not been allowed to flourish, has found all sorts of forms to become extremely potent. And one of the very simple ways is the fact that it becomes disseminated into smaller and smaller and smaller spaces, or let's say into more and more fragments. And that, I think, could be something extremely positive. I think the key, a terribly important thing in the future, if you like, one thing that I dream of, is that, if you like, all over Britain, but anywhere, as it were, the theatre of the I want to call it local, but it's not really that. It's of the place where people live. That somehow that is revived. That people don't have to go to London to see the big musical, because there is also fostered this the possibility of local theatre, and theatre can take on so many different forms. It doesn't all have to be in London at all. Of course it doesn't. And so one of the things that I dream of is that it perhaps explodes out all over the place, so that the church halls or anywhere it's taken up as a form of the way that people can in fact come together and form their communities in a much stronger way. Without that, I don't think we actually as a species can survive. In a sense, theatre is a sign of a healthy society, just as well.
That's interesting. So one of the questions from Michael Thomas is, why do we need theatre now?
Yeah, well, exactly. Why should we need theatre now? Well, and what the hell does theatre do? Why not just put everything onto Netflix and television, have it on CDs? Why not just sit at home? Exactly. I mean, we have to move our bodies, otherwise we get very, very sick. So, we need to go out, but that's not really a reason to go to the theatre, because you could be in a room with people you don't want to be in with at all. Well, I think that there are specific reasons. I think that the sharing of stories is absolutely critical, and that's a very simple and obvious thing to say. But I think a more complicated thought is to do with time and the way that we live time now. I think one of the things that has happened as a consequence of COVID is that people have had to go and sit in their home, and they've contemplated about the fact that they go out there, they have to do this, they have to do that. And the way that we organize our time in order to see each other has come into question, because we can't. So, well, we come on Zoom, we do that. Yes, there's that, but there's also been time where we've just been sitting and thinking. And perhaps one of the things that we come to understand is the way that time impacts us on Western society in particular, where we have got to, as a consequence, gradually, more and more, as a consequence of the industrial project, and now with mass fanatical consumer capitalism. Time used to be, the past, the distant past, and the far future, which were in a sense part of us. And what has happened of course, is that distant past has got very close. And we can see this, for example, in the whole question of the reaction to George Floyd by very reactionary people in our society, saying, well, yeah, but the past is the past. It's a long time ago. Well, no, it's not, particularly if you see that wonderful interview with Michael Holding, who says, no, 400 years ago is now, it's here and now. So what is the perception of time which is blocking us from doing that? Well, it's the recent past and the near future. So if I want to buy something, I think I will buy that. I'm going to the shop, I buy it, and now it's already in the past. But the future, in other words, it's a very short window between past and future, past and future, past and future. There's no present in there, which includes this huge thing of a far past and a distant future. And something that happens in the theatre is, as I said before, you have to give yourself up to the time of the performance. You have to let go, perhaps to your great annoyance, but nonetheless, you have to do it. Of course, you have to do it within a music performance, but it has elements which are very close, and I've always believed that music and theatre are interconnected. And as poetry is, it's slightly different to literature, but it is this corporal being in the present. But in that present, I mean, especially if you believe kind of somebody like Carlo Rovelli and The Order of Time, where he basically tells you, if you read that book, that time doesn't exist at all. But if it does exist, it's because all of these times become present. And so the present becomes enlarged, and it touches the past, it touches the future. And this is absolutely essential to us if we are for us to be able to listen to each other, to be able to work together, to form a society together, to be in smaller societies, to be able to, for goodness sake, survive, given that we are in the moment of extraordinary peril. We need to be able to communicate, and in some small way. And by theatre, I mean, there's so many different forms of theatre. The theatre of the funeral, the theatre of the marriage, the theatre of sanctifying individual moments. My wife is extraordinary at being able to get our children to enjoy and also sanctify individual moments, to make them have a space around them, to give them, well, for want of a better word, a spiritual dimension. And however we mean that by spiritual, it certainly includes all the past that has ever been and all the future that will ever be.
So interesting.
That answers
all of this, and the sense of both of the compression of time and the enlargement that time gives us when it's in a contained space, because that's part of the theatrical experience too, that you are in a space, shared space.
It's a ritual too. You go in through the door and you find your seat, and I mean that ritual varies enormously all over the planet. And I was absolutely astonished, when I went to Japan for the first time and went to a kabuki performance, and when there's an incredibly sort of very high tension, incredibly emotionally delivered moment at the top of their voice, it goes up and up and up to a point you think it's practically opera. When it reaches the peak, people in the audience suddenly call out the name of the performer. Tanaka, Tanaka, like that, to make a contact with this peak of emotion. And it is about, there's also the theatre of eating together, and the theatre, and so on and so on. So
I want to take you through your theatre, because it seems to me that some of the things you've been talking about, quite a few of them, are actually embedded there from the very start. And when we said we were going to talk a little bit about your past, which we've seen, and Complicité's past, which we've seen unfurl in the opening images, some of them, we talked about three kinds of work that you do, and I just wanted to go through those because it's a way of thinking of these important things that you raised, but also a little bit about different kinds of form and the kind of play that form itself engenders. I mean, you know, I'm completely rapt by the fact that you can do things with your body. You know, that your body can turn into somebody else while I sit here and I'm always me. I mean, you know, it's terrifying. But let's go through this. So you have basically, very loosely, three kinds of work: the adaptation of existing texts, the fully devised plays, and then reimagining of the classics. Let's choose one from the adaptation mode and tell us how you go about it and where you start and where you get to and what the collective experience is. So the Three Lives of Lucy Cabrol, say.
Three Lives of Lucy Cabrol, which is a short story by John Berger in a collection called Into Their Labours, about the lives of mountain peasants, dominantly where he was living in the Haute-Savoie. A lot of them are experiences of people that he met. So Lucy Cabrol was a real woman, and he, that is not her name, but yeah, so this piece, I mean, why did I choose that? There were a lot of different reasons, you know, partly because John Berger came to see The Street of Crocodiles, and then I met him, and then I started a friendship with him, and I had loved this book, and I had actually forgotten about that particular story until a colleague of mine reminded me of it. But also I was working with several people. We've always worked from people from all over the place, and often in their own language. There were four performers: Lilo Bauer, Hélène Patterot, Hannes Flashberger, and Stefan Metz, who were all from, well, Hélène was not from a mountain community, but the other three were from mountain peasant villages, and that's how they grew up. And so I discussed it with them, and they were absolutely up for it. And they brought that experience to it. But essentially, it was a piece. The story touched me because it was so much about death in the end. It was about the relationship between the living and the dead constantly throughout, which John had participated in by going to live up there for you know, the last 40 or 50 years of his life. And he committed himself to that community utterly. And for them, the presence of their dead is, you know, that their world is not complete without their dead. And this is partly a story about that, but it's also a story about resistance, and about survival, and about the outsider. All of those things, in some sense, keep on coming back and back, you know, consciously or unconsciously, in the pieces that I've ended up doing. And so, I mean, how did we do it? Very simply, we would sit around, you know, we did not make an adaptation and then now we're going to stage it. It wasn't written down like that. There were ideas, there were fragments. We went, I spent time in the mountains and, you know, and went to these different places, to my friend Hannes Flashberger in Austria, to Stefan Metz in Switzerland, and to John in the Alps. And this gradually, there was a sense in which there is a common human experience. It's not about one particular group of people, but at its core is a very, very deep common experience of resistance to external forces, and particularly a relationship with the land. And so then we just started to make it over time in a room.
Like the encounter, really.
Yeah,
kind of like, think of it.
Kind of like the encounter. We would just go into a room and start to take the text and fragments and cut it up and put it back again, and divide into groups and so on and so forth, and gradually it would come to life. It came to life. And in a sense, the way, the means of exploring each particular creation is often, strangely, quite similar. So to treat the book as a kind of site that you dig into and you unearth, you excavate, and you find out what is at the heart of it, and then you gradually put it together. I mean, I think the same experience for me happened when we did a production of The Winter's Tale about 2 years before we did Lucy Cabrol, where I was working with my colleague, wonderful colleague and friend Annabelle Arden, and then the amazing Annie Castledine, who was absolutely brilliant. And there was a process again of excavation. She was more used to the idea of direction. She used to yell at us going, what are they doing over there in the corner? And Annabelle would have to say, well, I think they're just exploring something. So we would use the same, and she gradually got into it. We'd gradually use the same method. We'd go off and explore a scene, come back and say, look, we have found this, rather than just sort of standing up and saying, this is my character, and now I'm going to do that. Of course, that work came into it too, but there's a kind of, there's always been a kind of chaos in the way that we have worked, because in order to try and find that thing at the core of it, which appears to be, I mean, can you call it the truth, but the truthful thing, whatever it is, which you wish to convey, you wish, the audience must take away with them. And perhaps just simply ask the question, what did the author intend? We were very lucky in that particular instance, because John said that he didn't want any money for it, but his only payment was to come and watch us rehearse. So when we got stuck at one point, and we said, well, yeah, but if only there was a speech here, for him at this point. John said, he disappeared out of the room, and about 10 minutes later he came back and said, will this do? Will this help? He said, having written something on the back of an envelope. So it was
no storyboard to start. I mean, there were
pictures. I always draw pictures. And I make kind of scrapbooks, and I put things into them. I need to come at it. I listen to music. I need to think. I need to look at something else in order to be able to. If I just simply look at the text like that, I find that my mind doesn't. I mean, some people's minds work brilliantly just like that. Mine doesn't. I need to look at something else in order to understand this thing here.
And so, what happens with a play like Mnemonic, where in fact there is no original story to work from? There is no author. I mean, there's no John Berger in that. There's no, in that sense, adaptation. How do you put these? What disparate elements come into play?
I pause for a moment only because when I think of disparate elements, I think that something like Mnemonic, while for a long time, I mean, for maybe 5 years, I had, and more, I've become obsessed with this question of memory and how memory works. And also how memory works with identity. So is consciousness possible without memory? No, not really. So if we are who we are because of what we remember, how far back do we remember? And do we remember beyond our own lifetimes? Well, of course we do, because Lisa had a mother and a father. So part of your memories are things that have come down from them. And of course, they're made of their parents and their parents and their parents. And part of your heritage, I don't know all of your heritage or where your family comes from, but the memories of that, whatever form they take, of course, make up who you are. Now,
I read a book called The Memory Man.
Yeah, and of course, I had grown up in a background where I didn't really know quite where I came from, for the reason that my father was American born, my mother's mother was Irish, and yet I was English. And you know, my father was an academic. We grew up in a slightly rarefied atmosphere of Cambridge. But, you know, I kept on asking myself, I wanted to belong. So I remember going out into the fens and thinking, you know, am I a fenman? You know, is that what I am? Because is this my land? That's what I kept on asking myself, you know, being surrounded by very eccentric people very often, and then yet having a very intimate relationship with the land, because every winter it used to freeze and you'd go out into the fens and you would skate and you would see all the fen people skating, and you'd see Dutch people coming over and you'd realize that there was a relationship with the Dutch and East Anglia and so on and so forth. So I felt I was constantly asking, you know, where do I come from? And I suppose that's one reason why and then I asked myself that question when I went away and I lived in France for 4 years, is why do I feel more comfortable here than I did in Britain? Well, it was partly because it was the beginning of the era of Margaret Thatcher, and I felt a great deal more at home in a socialist country than I did in under what was, you know, happening with the beginning of you know, the terrible consequence of free market economics, which we're still living under. So I mean, there was a lot of things, you know, the fact that I was speaking in French, that I learned French and I started to think and dream in French. So all of those things had been around. So when I started to make mnemonic, that was key to me. And so, and the further back I delved, the more I wanted to make a relationship with a deep past. So I took the story of the Iceman, the man who was found in 1991 on the borders between Austria and Italy, who came to be called Ötzi, who was found to be 5,300 years old, and he was perfectly preserved in the ice at the top of the mountain with all his clothes and all his objects, his knife that people still hold. And actually that was a consequence of Lucy Cabral, because I talked a lot to John about this, and we used to play games by writing ideas on cards, and we sort of made a story by writing each other sort of things across the table, and we look at them and then we do another one and we do another one, and we had fragments. So just as memory is made up really of fragments, the piece itself was made from fragments, both fictional and if you like, documentary. So, you know, I gave a preposterous speech at the beginning, which was about the biochemistry of memory.
I love that.
But it was also, it was absolutely true, all of it. The biochemistry was real, so much so that I was asked to deliver it to the first year in Columbia University, the neuroscience department
You came to King's as well when I was there to talk about something akin.
Yeah. And so. But I suppose the other thing around making something like that, these are not, I have to say, the making of something like this is also, of course, it's not just to do with me, it's to do with my connection with the different people. I assembled somebody from Greece, my friend Katrin Cartledge, again, Stefan Metz from Switzerland, somebody from France, and French-German border, and so on. So they were sort of from, they were from everywhere, this group of people. And that was very important because in a sense, I was trying to look at a European identity, if you can call it that. I don't know if I was looking at it, but that was the thing. But also at that time, it was made because we were also because there were people around me marvelous people around me who were making it happen. So in other words, a whole production team, my producer, Judith Dimmond, there were people in the office, there were people who would suggest things, there were people I talked to. You know, I used to go to lectures and talk to the anthropologist, Jack Goody. And, you know, so there were many, many people who actually, as it were, brought that into being. To make a devised piece, you have to have a leap of confidence from the people who administrate it and who produce it. They've got to say, well, we don't know what you're doing, but we believe in you. Because very often when you propose such a thing to a theatre, people go, yeah, well, where's the script? But if you do it with a group of people who are prepared to put their lives on the line for it, for which I am incredibly grateful. And it's so when you ask me, you know, how did that come about? It comes about because of all these people, because of a group of people, and that's part of the nature of theatre. The theatre is always a community. It's never.
I'm sort of being told that question time is almost there, and I want to take up a question that actually came up from here, but also for me. And I just want to ask you very, very quickly about your own inspiration as a theatre maker. When you started out and indeed throughout, is there anything you want to pinpoint?
Well, of course, my mother, who was never allowed to go into the theatre because her father said that women don't work and they certainly don't go into the theatre, she used to write little plays when we were young. Very often pantomimes. And so as a consequence, the pantomime for me was an incredibly important event everywhere, the English pantomime. I loved it because it was extremely funny. I loved the figure of the dame who used to speak directly to the audience, of course, and come on with a different costume each time, and the idea of cross-dressing, that genders disappeared, that anybody could be anybody, the fact that the audience participated in it. This is when I was very small, but then my mother also, and my parents also used to take me to, again, the local theatre. You know, we didn't go, that was where it started. And also, because we lived in a university town, there were students who were making theatres, and sometimes they would need children. And on occasions, I would go and perform with them. You know, but that sort of so in a sense, performing. You know, I sort of can't remember a single year of my life where I didn't perform in some sense. And when I decided to start performing, it was not like, you know, I'm going to take this decision, but I'm going off point here. What were the things that were important to me? I think that as I saw more and more through the 70s, there were things that happened in the theatre which opened my eyes to things that I didn't know. I remember seeing Sizwe Banze's Dead for the first time as a teenager, and suddenly, you know, when you know, they took off their clothes and said, you know, I am a man. I understood more about apartheid in that single moment, and my life was absolutely changed as a consequence. Yes, when I was little, my mother would refuse to buy oranges in the market, and I'd say, why? And she'd say, well, because they come from South Africa, we can't buy those. And then she would explain to me. But that piece of theatre really shattered me. And then I went to see, I also went to see Shakespeare and all sorts of things like that. But also by the end of the 70s, there was a remarkable period at the Riverside Studios under David Gothard, which was bringing in a lot of theatre from all over the world. And suddenly I started to see theatre from Japan and from India and from South America, and realize that what I had seen on the English stage was not the only way to make theatre. And of course, incredible things coming out of the 70s, where people started to perform more and more and more on the streets as protests, but also as sort of what would now be called immersive theatre. And very specifically, I remember the Suji Teriyama and the Tenjo Sajiki, and then seeing Tadeusz Kantor from Poland for the first time, which shattered me. And I went to see it again and again. Absolutely extraordinary, with the same group of people who had been performing all their lives together. And I suppose that's something which I find has happened, which has been very beautiful during this time of lockdown, is that I've contacted a lot of people with whom I have performed, who've been part of the company for the last 30 or 40 years even. And we have made promises that we need to still perform together.
You've just answered one of the questions from Patsy Trench, which asks, what have you been doing during lockdown? And have you been working on future projects?
Well, lots of future projects, writing notes, writing ideas. Yeah, there are many things going on. Because Germany is opening early, I am going to work with my old colleague Annabelle, who I haven't worked for 20 years with or more, maybe 30 years. I'm not quite sure when we last worked together. We're going to work in Berlin. In the autumn on a piece of Kleist, Heinrich von Kleist, called Michael Kohlhaas.
Oh, I love it.
Which is about resistance to injustice, really. That's yeah, it's about what happens when you don't get justice. And of course it was the influence for lots of different other people's literary works later. Ragtime, for example, Doctorow, based it on Michael Kohlhaas and so on. So yeah, that will happen. Lots of other things.
Okay. Anne Dove asks or says, I'd love to hear your definition of theatre. You did mention that you had one before, but you didn't actually get to it. So what is your definition of theatre?
Oh, God.
Okay, well, give us the Greek.
the Greek, theatron, which means the seeing place, So it is a place where I think that you can understand something. You can see externally what is happening, but you also see internally. So it's a place of revelation. As we know in Aristotelian tragedy, the importance is to evoke pity, so that with whatever it was, a quarter of Athens sitting in Epidavros, 13,000 people, it was a place which essentially humanized the population, because they went through a cathartic experience. They re-experienced something. So, just as when you go to a wedding, it's incredibly moving because you collectively experience the love at the best weddings, the love of these two people coming together. And that is a marvelous form of theatre. The theatre is a place where, as John Berger says, it's a place of, I think, a ritual, a repeated ritual, where I've got the quote here. He says, I'm trying to answer this question. Deep within the nature of theatre is a sense of ritual return. Mm. And so this sense of returning again and again and again to the same place. We play the same thing over and over. We play the same stories. We tell the same stories. Why? Because we need to humanize ourselves. And perhaps that is something I feel particularly, is that we live in an era of dehumanization. There is something dehumanizing about extreme capitalism, I think, which is the period that we're living in. It's in Lewis Hyde's The Gift. What is the difference between a gift and a commodity? The thing that you buy, you know, you go in and you buy your hacksaw and you have your hacksaw. There is nothing inner that is exchanged. But when you give something, you exchange something of yourself. And that is part of the nature of theatre, because when you are an actor, what you know is that it's not you making the theatre, but it's the audience.
Let me ask you on behalf of writers or theatre writers, you say somewhere, I picked up a quote from somewhere, a play is not the theatre, a play is a musical score. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just I mean, it can become theatre in the hands of good theatre makers. Recently, I did a production of The Cherry Orchard, and it was awful, because I kept on finding, I tried to play the notes or get the notes to be played, and they kept on falling apart. And I go, but where's it gone? You know, where's the music? Why can't, and that's, you know, and realizing that the music of Chekhov is extremely difficult, particularly if it's not in its original language. And that is a thing, is that the theatre tends towards musicality. It's why poetry works extraordinarily well in the theatre. It's why people are constantly wanting to, you know, haul Kate Tempest into the theatre, and why they go to see her, because her oration is an act of theatre. And there's something very important about the difference between you know, there is a natural musicality in a dialogue. You know, you've got to say something and say it again and say it again and say it again. You know, and the gaps that you leave, the pauses. If there's too longer pauses between one bit of dialogue and another, we're all asleep. If it's too fast, we can't hear it. It's got to absolutely have this musicality. I'm not really defining theatre here, but oh yes, because you asked me about the musical nature of it. I think, of course, you know, there is an aspect of theatre which I think is like poetry, which is about listening. The audience are listening. We call them the audience, the people who listen. The French call them les spectateurs, the people who watch. There is a fundamental difference. We have a greater difficulty in seeing things, I think, within our particular island Anglo-Saxon culture.
I think it's Protestantism versus Catholicism.
Yes, it's very, 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 that's true. And it's very much reflected in the way that critics talk about the theatre. You know, one of the things that I found difficult when starting out is we would make things which were not with words, and critics wouldn't really know what to say about it. They say, well, there isn't really a story, you know, they haven't really understood, or they say, well, that's just sort of technique, rather than trying to read what is being said. In France, it's much easier to put up a series of pictures and people read it. There is a much deeper visual nature to their culture than there is in ours. I mean, often I ask this, if you name, 20 great British painters, you're going to be hard pressed going back 500 years. I mean, it's going to be difficult if you're an art historian. What?
We imported some.
We imported some, that's true. But if you go to Belgium, or if you go to France, if you go to Italy, or to Spain, there they are, the great list of, that's a difference. But I think there's something deeply wonderful about the way that you listen. And by listening, it's a quality of attention. It's different to hearing something. Listening involves a kind of giving. It's what I said before, you have to give up to something. It's like when you're listening to a piece of Bach, you have to give yourself up to it, and you have to give yourself up to something in the theatre too, but also listen with your eyes, listen with all your senses.
John Berger once said to me that he never had ideas, he just listened.
Well, that's absolutely true. He was one of the great, yes, I would say that was his, that's who he was. Yeah.
Okay, let's listen to Claire Perkins, who has a question here for you. COVID has been the big thing lately, followed closely by Black Lives Matter. What are your thoughts on diversity?
My thoughts on it? I'm much more interested in listening to Michael Holding, but I also feel a deep sense of responsibility, nonetheless, to speak about it, because we have to fundamentally accept and face something within our culture, Western culture, white culture, something deeply. We have to, which we have never done. The majority of white people feel that they can be sympathetic, but they will not do the work to place themselves in the position of other people, and thereby begin to take action against, to really open ourselves out to our history and what has happened, and why we are in this, still in a situation that we're in, where George Floyd can be murdered in broad daylight, and still, there is not equality between us. So, I mean, my main thoughts are about the work that I feel that I have to continue to do myself in taking responsibility. Thinking, well, because I'd read, when it first came out, René Edo Lodge, I thought, well, I'm kind of doing the work. But again and again and again, confronting the fact that, no, there is more to do. There is more to understand. And it is not a question of this being a moment of Black Lives Matter. It's absolutely at the core of who we are. That's what I feel, really. In the same way as I feel that the ecological disaster which is engulfing us is part of the same story. Because the moment with the industrial project, you begin to see people as objects. Of course, that has happened throughout history and prehistory in another way, but not on this scale. Which is a part of the dehumanization of society. We also dehumanize nature. We live in a dualistic society where things are divided into yes and no, and black and white, and nature is out there and we are here. We're all part of nature, and we can't escape it, just as we can't escape the planet. And we are all part of the history of slavery and of the oppression of the colonial project. And we have to accept that we are all part of that, and it is everybody's responsibility. And those two things are intimately connected, because the way that we treat nature is also as something separate and a commodity to be used. But those are some. There's too much to say.
Here's another big one, Simon. This is from Jake Shirsagar. Can you speak a little about death and how to see it clearly without the fog of anxiety and fear? This is really to do with our current condition.
Golly, I thought I was just going to be talking about.
Well, you do make.
Yeah,
Cabrol was about death.
It was about death. Yes. No, I mean the very first second piece that I ever made was about the death of my father, which was called A Minute Too Late, and it was about every circumstance surrounding the fact of somebody dying, which was my personal experience of it, in which there was a great deal of embarrassment about it in our culture. So I remember people crossing the street rather than wanting to talk to me because they didn't know what to say. And I remember coming into because I was relatively young, 18, coming into my father's funeral and being very aware of people looking at you and almost kind of, they're the really sad ones. Those are the really sad ones. But in fact, you've done a lot of very, very powerful grieving before that. But also, it was with my father's death that was really a huge encounter for me, because I didn't understand. I could feel certain things, but also I didn't understand why I didn't feel certain things. I do think I've said this about, I feel as though I'm going to sort of repeat myself, but I think that throughout history, the dead and the living were always interconnected, because it was the ultimate experience of the living. That's where we were going towards. And so there's a natural connection with the dead. But I think in our time, there has been a breaking of this connection between the living and the dead, which is I'm going to quote John Berger again, with disastrous results for the living who now think of the dead as the eliminated. And so in order to find, in order for us to be able to go forward, it is about listening and connection. But the connection is not just between Lisa and Simon, or between me and my wife Cassie and my children and so on, but it is between the living and the dead. The dead have to be part of our culture, just as because in that way the unborn, the future, also exists. We see ourselves as part of a continuity rather than a separate thing. Part of the dehumanization of capitalism is this growth of narcissism, if you like. And one of the incredible things in our last talk that we did, the Q&A after the encounter, with Takuma Kuikuru, who spoke to us from the Amazon, my friend who's a filmmaker who's living in a village, and they're self-isolating because they are deeply under threat. Bolsonaro has now just recently, 2 days ago, refused to offer them any extra help. He said, we're not going to offer indigenous people help. one of their great fears within their village, and they have an intimate connection with the dead, is what they will do with the dead. Because for them, not to be able to touch the dead body, not to be able to bury it where they need to bury it, and then disinter it, and then clean the bones, and then rebury them, and then spend a week in which they celebrate their dead in this very, very extraordinary ritual called the Kwarup, is to drive at the very heart of who they are as human beings and how they see themselves as interconnected with everything and everything around them, the living, the dead, the forest, the earth, everything. And therefore, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I do think this is very important now, because I think a lot of people at the moment, having had relatives and near ones die and not being able to take part in ritual occasions and funerals, are actually suffering very deeply from this rupture in, even though we are a rather cold and unceremonious culture, we do still have ceremonies that are important, and the dead do still speak to us, and it's very hard if the ritual hasn't been partaken of. So what you say is crucial.
I think it's absolutely crucial, and the brutality of it, and also the insensitivity on the part of our leaders to say, you know, we are triumphing against COVID-19 when 65,000 people have died. More people than, I think, than died in the, civilians died in Britain in the Second World War.
Yeah.
And they are not, everyone marked the dead. Everyone marked the dead in 1945. But here, you know, Johnson and Gove and Cummings, they go out and shop, you know. Let's open pubs before we open schools.
Okay, I'm laughing. I shouldn't be laughing. I'm going to give you a really even more difficult final question.
I know.
Since you've now given us so much, I'm going to combine two questions. One is from Sebastian Alonso, and asks, what is something theatre companies must change, taking into consideration how COVID has changed the world? And I wanted to combine that with a kind of parting question for me, which is, if I had a very large checkbook and I were to give you an open check to take to the nation as a kind of czar for the theatre and for plays perhaps, what would you do? So take COVID into consideration. What are you going to make? And here's your checkbook. Open.
I think COVID is this disease which has not hit everybody equally. It has wrought terrible violence on communities, poorer communities, on BAME communities. So if you are, you know, I'm incredibly lucky. I'm living miles away from anywhere, and so it's been okay. But it's been, you know, it's been an extraordinary moment. But I have also lost 4 friends. And everyone is saying, well, what should the theatre do? I think the important thing is that we need to listen, to find a way in which, I mean, this is to do with your checkbook, is that the community, the place, the sites, the different places begin to have a voice. And one small way to have that voice is for there to be a celebration and a culture of place. So that Robert Macfarlane has written very beautifully about the way that dialect terms for nature have been disappearing. But these terms, for example, allow people to attach themselves and have a very specific sense of where they live. And for me, I would open all the theatres that have been closed in the regions into all these areas. I would make it possible for companies to be able to be formed all the way up to the top of Scotland, all the way down to the end of Cornwall. I would push the money out into these places so that we can have theatre in Welsh. We can have theatre spoken only in the dialect of Newcastle or Carlisle or Manchester or wherever, so that these places are not these places. All the sense of the importance of everywhere that you live is nurtured, if you like. Culture also means it comes from cultivating the earth, and a culture is as it were a solution in which things can grow.
Can we also cultivate the high streets?
What?
Can we also cultivate the high streets and take over all those empty shops and put theatre and writers and children into those?
Well, I certainly think there is something to do with that. I think there's something absolutely key to do with part of the dehumanization of capitalism is to bring cheap stuff from elsewhere and flood it into smaller places, so they no longer have the resources. They become dependent on the multinational, become dependent on the vast profit-making activities, and that individual places start to lose what is theirs. Now, I'm not saying, oh, the poor old little baker and the little butcher. Well, yes, there is that, but we need to find a new way in what we do locally fosters a sense of the fact that here we also have culture. Culture doesn't exist as a thing outside of us. It's not a handbag on the arm. It is the arm. Without it, we can't actually exist. I can't speak, as it were, without culture. To actually form words is art itself. So there isn't a separation between art and human beings. It's not something for the elite. It is who we are as human beings. And so every town has to be given to, every place that people live. People have to address themselves to the people who live in the tower blocks. What is their culture? What can we give them? We have to reconceive it as people reconceived it or tried to reconceive it after the Second World War. But will they do it? Do they have the humanity?
Yes.
I mean, the people.
I think we have to stop there, but that was absolutely wonderful. Art is what we all have, and we bring it to each other. I'm very grateful to you for this. I'm very grateful to Complicité for putting it together, and to the Royal Society of Literature for helping out. And I want to see the next play or the next bit of theatre.
I'm sorry we weren't able to answer more questions, and I think I got a bit verbose, but I felt as if I was just in your front room chatting to you.
You are.
You
are in my front room. You're on my desk.
Hundreds of people elsewhere. But I do want to thank
you everybody everywhere, and I'm afraid we're going to leave you now. Simon, thank you for all that wonderful work, and more to come.
And thank you for listening. and
Thank
support.
you all for listening. Bye.